Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to our final Well-Led Practice webinar of the year. It's December already. Can't believe how quickly it's gone round. And there are some Christmas jumpers here for you to see. I hope you guys have got yours on too. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Claire Sieber. I'm a GP and I run the Well-Led Practice, also known as a Well-Led provider, with a team, some of whom you will meet shortly. What we're going to talk about in this session, which is a sort of wrap up from the year, is give you an update, an update of the update of the recent CQC changes, because there's constantly things going on at the moment and new things being released. So I'll sort of talk you through where we're at with that. I'm going to summarise some of the key learning points that we've had from all of our webinars across the year. For those of you that haven't attended any of them, they're all on our website, our YouTube channel, so you can catch up with them, including the slides. But we basically took a quality statement from the Well-Led key question per webinar, and Gabi, the former CQC inspector member of our team who's on the call, broke down that quality statement and explained what it was and what we needed to be doing and what we needed not to be doing in order to get at least a good rating for that. So there were some key take-homes that I'll summarise and share with you. And then we will put Gabi in the hot seat and we will ask her some questions that you've submitted in advance, as well as some questions that Gary, our former practice manager, would like to put to her, and Ketan, our GP partner and business owner, who will be joining us later, to put some to her as well. And then I'll talk you through a little bit about what we do at the Well-Led Practice, and then we'll end with a little bit from the medicines management team, who've kindly sponsored some of our webinars this series and made sure that we were able to keep them free for everyone. So that's a rough plan of what we're going to do this afternoon. This is all of the team who you will meet shortly. I won't introduce them for the sake of time, but we're all working or have worked closely with providers. And Gabi has actually worked for the CQC as well for a period of time as an inspector. And you will meet Mohammed on the call today from Medicines Management Team. So just a little bit of an update of where we are with CQC. I think it probably won't have escaped you that not too many months ago, the CQC themselves basically got rated as inadequate. They were called not fit for purpose by West Streeting after what was called the Dash review. Penny Dash went in and had a review of the CQC sort of processes. And they have committed to doing some things as a result of that review, some of which they've started to do now, and some of which they say they will bring in early 2025 if they manage to stick to their promised timeframes. So the portal's going because it was rubbish. The single assessment framework approach, the approach of using the same framework to inspect all providers regardless of size or sector, so using the same framework for a hospital as you do for a small care home, is going in the bin, and they're going to take a different approach for each provider. They're also going to revert to their old way of inspecting in terms of they're doing more full comprehensive inspections rather than targeted bits and bobs here and there. They might scrap the one-word rating, so that would be outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate. Although I appreciate one of those as 2 words, because it's very difficult to encompass everything about a provider in 1 word. They've also now scrapped their scoring at an evidence category level. And what that means is for each quality statement, there were accepted types of evidence that you were able to produce in order to get a good score. And you would be graded for each type of evidence that you submitted. So for example, for well-led, one type of evidence might be feedback from staff, and another type of evidence might be your processes, your policies and procedures. And each of those different types, the feedback and the policies, were scored separately, and that's now being scrapped. And the scoring is just for all of the evidence that you provide for that particular quality statement. They've said that the quality statements, so those are what used to be called the CLOEs that sit under each domain, or now known as key question, may change. So we will just keep you abreast of that. They've also said that old scores won't be used when they're going in and rating a service. So what they had been doing recently, they go in, look at a few quality statements, and then combine those scores with your previous scores from the last time you were inspected, and then get a kind of amalgamated overall rating. That is now going. So they're only using new, fresh things before their eyes rather than anything that you've done in the past. And I suppose that also ties in with them saying they're going to be going back to a more full look rather than just targeted stuff. They also say they're going to develop a handbook of rating characteristics. They've said they're going to do this in early 2025. And in that handbook, I'm sorry about the spelling mistake there, is that they're going to tell us what for each quality statement is required for a provider to look good or outstanding or be requires improvement or inadequate. So it should be easier for us to work out what the CQC are looking for in each quality statement. That would be the theory. Because after all, this shouldn't be an opaque process. If the CQC is genuinely there to improve quality, it should tell us what we can do and then we do it, and therefore our quality will improve. It doesn't need to be sort of opaque blindfolds and stuff around it. And they're also going to be ramping up their inspections because they've got a huge backlog that they need to address. So that's not so good news for those of us who have been waiting since 2015 or 2016 for an inspection. It'll probably come a bit quicker than it would have done 6 months ago because of their new commitment to ramping things up. So that's a summary of where they're most recently at. And this is how we've been doing in 2024. For those of you that have been on our webinars before, each month we crunch the latest reports that have come through. This month, for November, actually, the report from the CQC was empty. It didn't have any reports in it. So I don't know what's happened to November. Clearly there must have been some reports published, but they haven't been shared yet. But this is where we are at in all of the inspections that have been done in 2024. So over 1,000 care homes have been inspected, nearly half that number of GP practices. Hardly anybody is getting an outstanding these days, 1 or 2%. I think we all sort of know that now. But is a significant proportion that are getting requires improvement or inadequate, not meeting the good threshold. 40% if you look at care homes, 17%, so nearly a fifth if you're looking at GP practices. And this seems to be up on where it's been in previous years. So something is happening that is resulting in it being more difficult for us to score good in CQC inspections, whether that be a change to the process or something that's going on at provider level or combination of all. There were some new quality statements when the new single assessment framework was released a year ago, that if you're still following the old framework and Chloe's, you will have completely missed. One of the new quality statements in Well-Led was called Freedom to Speak Up, FTSU. Completely new, so something that you need to make sure you're doing if you haven't done it already. And it's not the same as whistleblowing. So you can't just take your whistleblowing policy and scrap the word whistleblowing and change it for freedom to speak up. Those are two sort of separate things that sit independently to each other. And when Gabi has been looking through the reports about this, there was a key kind of theme that was picked out from some of them, and that was about the independence or the perceived independence of the freedom to speak up guardian. And these were examples from GP practices, but equally they would apply to care homes or any other provider. And there was an example given here in red. So this is an example where the good threshold wasn't met. And one of the reasons it wasn't met was because the freedom to speak up guardian, the person appointed for people to go to if they felt there was an issue they needed to raise and they didn't feel comfortable to raise it in the context of their organisation openly, that person was the manager of the organisation. And the feedback from staff was that that person wasn't independent enough. They were looking for somebody else, external, independent, to go to. And then the example that we've got in green there is an example where a practice has identified that that might be an issue, and as well as having an internal freedom to speak up person, they also had appointed an external independent person for staff members to go to if they felt they weren't able to go to that internal person, and that then hit the good threshold. So it's just something for organisations to bear in mind when they're deciding who to appoint, that it might be that they want to appoint somebody who's perceived by their staff as independent. And maybe that's in addition to someone else rather than a replacement for an internal person. So some thoughts there. Gabi really helpfully produced this table when we broke down the freedom to speak up quality statement that I've shared with you. And these are the types of evidence that she felt would be acceptable for you to submit to the CQC to show that you're hitting that particular quality statement. And she broke it down in terms of the feedback from staff and then the processes and the outcomes that they'd also be looking for you to build up that evidence. So that's a table of what kind of things you ought to be looking to provide the CQC to show that you're meeting this quality statement. You will get the slides afterwards when we send a link round at the end. Once the webinar's been recorded, there's a link to download the slides underneath the recording. So don't feel like you need to take frantic notes. The other one that I'm focusing now on in this roundup is the environmental sustainability quality statement, because again, that's completely brand new for this new single assessment framework in 2024. So if you're working by the old framework, you'll have missed this one too. And it's not clear whether they're going to be inspecting practices and other smaller providers, so not hospitals, against this quality statement. They could, they're just not being clear at the moment. But actually, when we went through this on our last webinar, we felt that probably most practices or care homes were probably doing some of this already, even if they weren't thinking of it as doing it from an environmental sustainability point of view, such as recycling, reducing your energy bills, reducing your usage of single-use items. It's all stuff that we'll be doing because it makes sense from a business point of view as well. So these are some resources that we cobble together that are useful for practices or care homes, useful things that you can say that you're doing that will also save you money and will be good for the environment, that will help you meet this particular quality statement if suddenly the CQC turn around and start inspecting against it. And these are all links that you'll be able to click on when you've got the slides to take you through to the websites. When we covered this quality statement as well, we also reflected on the fact that each organisation probably has somebody in it who can be a sort of green champion, who's quite dedicated about this kind of stuff and could easily take some projects and run with it and be your green lead quite happily. So it's worth thinking about if there's somebody in your organisation who could do that role. It would add more value to their role after all if it was something that they enjoy doing. I'll do 2 more tips and then we'll move over to our Q&A session. So this was an interesting one from the Learning, Improvement and Innovation Quality Statement. And these are 3 examples of where a provider wasn't quite meeting the mark. 2 of these examples are all related to staff development, mandatory training, learning needs to stay competent and capable at doing the job. And there seems to be a general consensus here from the CQC that staff need to be given the opportunities to do all of this in their contracted hours, and they shouldn't have to be cobbling around afterwards to do it themselves. In the bottom example, you can see that staff were not only expected to do that kind of training, but were also expected to keep up to date with emails, significant events, meetings, all in their own time. Which wouldn't be acceptable to the CQC. The other thing that the CQC will want to make sure is that absolutely everything that you're doing is documented. It's not acceptable anymore to just say and have a clear process of how you, for example, disseminate learning after a significant event. You will then be expected to show that you have disseminated learning after a significant event, for example, by showing evidence of who was at the meeting where it was discussed or showing who was copied into the email. And then those particular people that it was discussed with will then be asked whether they remember what the learning events were from significant events. And then if they were, then that shows that your process is working. But if any of that falls down, then you haven't demonstrated enough evidence to the CQC. So you need to have your process, and then you need to make sure it's actually effective. Your staff will be able to feedback that it is, and your documentation backs up everything that you say that you do. And here's one from the equality statement that's called Workforce Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. Sorry, it's a big mouthful. This is an interesting one about vision and values and strategy in a practice. Here's an example of staff not being aware of a practice's vision and values, and the CQC saying that that is not good enough. Your staff are expected to know the vision and values and what their role is in achieving them at the practice. And ideally, they should know that because they have been involved in the creation of them in the first place. The bottom right box is also an example of where the CQC felt things weren't going well enough. There's some positive things to start with. So this is a particular provider that sought some feedback from their staff by way of a survey, and then identified some issues and made some suggestions about how they were going to improve. However, where they fell down was that the ways in which they felt they were going to improve and what they were planning to do in order to improve were found to not be robust enough by the CQC. So you need to make sure that whatever plans you're putting in place to make your improvements are realistic, doable, but are also going to get you to the place that you need to be. So on that note, let's move on to some of our Q&A, because that's really what this session is about. This is our opportunity to put some questions to Gabi, our former CQC inspector. Normally in our webinars, she asks us the questions and puts us on the spot about a particular quality statement, but we're going to flip it this time since it's Christmas. So these are some questions that were submitted in advance by some of the people who registered for the webinar. So Gabi, if I read out the first one, would you then be able to respond? Yeah. So the first one is specifically about performance management. It's asking, how does the CQC or does the CQC assure itself that your staff are being appropriately performance managed? For example, do they look at probationary periods and how you might be passing them? Do they look in detail at your appraisals and the documents behind them? Do they check people's personal development plans and make sure that people are actually acting on them? Gabi, over to you.
Thanks, Claire. Definitely a little bit nerve-wracking, isn't it? I've got an understanding of how Gary and Katana felt for the year. So in terms of the first part of that question, looking at performance management, in short, yes, they would be looking at the processes that are in place to feel assured that staff are being performance managed effectively. It's really important to just clarify, however, that the CQC don't regulate the performance of individual clinicians. That obviously sits with the relevant regulatory bodies. So if they were to identify any concerns themselves about a particular individual, then they would need to have that conversation with the registered manager or the nominated individual, and then potentially make a referral to the appropriate body themselves. So just to make sure that you have that kind of distinction in mind in terms of what their role is from a performance management or concerns point of view. The main thing that they will be looking at is the effectiveness of the processes that you have in place. So when I'm thinking back to various inspections that I've done over the years, where I've either seen examples of poor practice when interviewing or meeting with staff, or when the managers themselves have told me that there are particular staff members or one particular staff member that's being performance managed, I'm really not there sort of as an inspector, you're not really there to make judgments or to get into the nitty-gritty about that particular individual. What you're looking at is the effectiveness of the process that the manager has in place to reduce risk. So we're thinking about potentially the incident that has led to performance management could be having a risk or could be having an impact on the patient group or the individuals receiving a regulated activity. So the first thing that they'd be looking at is, what have you done as a leader or as a manager to reduce that risk and make sure that the service that you're overseeing is continuing to run in a safe manner. Then they'd be thinking about the policies, the processes, and the effectiveness of the systems that you have in place. So I can give an example of when I recently did an inspection. We were speaking to staff about their understanding of policies and procedures, because the manager had recently introduced updated policies, and there was no system in place for them to feel assured that staff had read them initially. But then what they'd done is they'd recognised this, so they'd been really positive about it, and they put in protected learning time into staff diaries. So once a fortnight there was a specific time dedicated to reviewing the policies, and they'd calculated, roughly we can read a couple of policies in this amount of time, so over the space of this many months we should have assurance that staff have done this. However, when I was speaking to staff, they were very open and honest about the fact that they just weren't doing that. So they weren't using the time that had been dedicated to them. For various reasons, they were giving, the workload's too high. We actually prioritise other things over the reading of the policies. We don't always attend those particular kind of sessions. They were drop-in sessions because we have other things to do, or we don't think it's a priority. So that is actually an example of a number of staff who aren't adhering to their job description or aren't working in line with what they should be, in order to then be effective in their role and to be safe in their role. So from an inspection point of view, that's very much, it's not for me as an inspector to then just simply say, okay, they're not doing what they should be, it's a bad practice, etc., etc. What I then am doing is going back to the manager and having that conversation with them. If I feel assured, for example, as I've mentioned, that they actually do have the systems in place, they've got dedicated time, they've got processes in place, I can see from the diary management that it's there, I can see that from email communication that staff are being reminded about the importance of it, I'm then going to be just saying to the practice manager or the registered manager, what's your plan or your process to manage this? Is it a case that those staff are taken off patient-facing duties until they've completed this? Is it a case that you are going to have to follow the performance management process? Are you going to have to dedicate additional time for them? Do you need to call them in for one-to-ones? So it's really a conversation that the inspector would be leading, but they'd be having with the manager to find out what their systems are. If the practice manager then comes back and says, oh, I know it's a nightmare, this is, I see this all the time, it's just the way it is, then of course there's no assurance that things will be dealt with. So that would indicate a poor service. But if we feel assured, having spoken to the leadership team, that there will be systems in place, they will be followed effectively, then that would provide assurance from a safety perspective. So I think it's really looking at the effectiveness rather than making an individual judgment in that particular scenario. Probationary periods and appraisals, do they check the development plans? In short, the answer is yes, they would check all of those. Under the regulations, they do have the powers to inspect, and that covers staff documents as well as documents for medical records or care plans for people receiving care. And in particular, if we look at regulation 18, the intention of that specific regulation is to make sure that as a registered manager or as a provider, you do have enough competent and experienced staff and skilled staff to provide safe care. So they would be looking at all of those documents. I think if we have a look at the how element, so particularly for the appraisals, there's many elements to an appraisal, isn't there? So, or a probationary period. So it might be that they're looking at I suppose because of the practicalities of an inspection, they would never be able to assess every single detail of a probationary period or an appraisal process, just because that's a full-time job in itself. But what they would be doing is looking at the quality of different elements. So, for example, they might look at the effectiveness of one-to-ones. So they'd be speaking to staff members and saying, do you receive one-to-ones during your probationary period? Are they more regular than they would be outside of your probation period? Do you feel that they've been supportive? You'd then be cross-correlating that with the supervision notes that are being provided. You'd be looking at the training, so you'd want to see completion certificates for the training, and again speaking to staff to make sure that they felt that it was of high quality. You'd be looking potentially at shadowing shifts or competency assessments that have been completed, and specifically here, because nobody is perfect, especially if it's a new role for somebody, you're looking at how areas for improvement were recognised during those shadowing shifts or those competency assessments or during the one-to-ones, how they were recognised, and then how the areas for improvement were then documented, acted upon, so facilitated. You know, do you as a manager need to facilitate additional learning, additional time, additional resources to support that individual during their probation period? And then they want to be making sure that they've been reassessed from a competency and a safety perspective. So it's following the journey that you're taking with a staff member during that initial period. As I've mentioned, they'll obviously speak to staff. So they'll want to speak to staff who might have recently finished their probation, staff who are in their probation period, but they'll also be speaking to staff who are responsible or who are contributing towards their evaluation. So if it was one GP who was shadowing another, they'd speak to the GP that was overseeing that shadowing opportunity or that competency assessment to make sure that they felt that they had an opportunity to evaluate the performance and to provide feedback to the manager. They'll also then obviously want to speak to patients or people receiving care. So how do you feel that the colleagues or the staff that you're receiving support from are knowledgeable, are competent, and do you feel safe when speaking to them or receiving care from them? And then they'll cross-correlate all of that with your policies and procedures. So yeah, for anyone that's come to these webinars over the year, that's what we often say. It's really about triangulating the people that we speak to, the processes that you have, and then the policies and procedures that you have in place, and making sure they all align. So in short, yes, they will be looking at your probation, they'll be looking at appraisals, and they'll be looking at PDPs, but they won't be sort of making individual judgments. They'll be looking more at the processes that are in place to provide assurance, to make sure that staff are safe and effective to work. That's the answer to the first question.
Thank you, Gabi. That was so helpful.
No worries.
Mind if I just mute you for a moment? I think there's a bit of, thanks. And that reminded me of something else that had come up on one of our previous webinars. I can't remember which one it was, Gabi, but it was about the clinical supervision, and that seemed to be a bit of a hot topic at the moment. Like, are you adequately supervising clinicians that need to be supervised, and who's doing that, and where's your evidence that that's being done, and does the person who's being supervised feel that they are getting enough supervision? So closing the loop and tying up all those loose ends and making sure that they're all in line with what your policy is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's interesting. And actually, we just had an example of it's slightly outside of this room, of their private practice that have just gone through registration. And because they are a one-person band, the CQC did need assurance from them about how they would seek clinical supervision and clinical guidance outside of their own practice. So they've had to access a mentor through a previous role who is a registered healthcare professional and set up a contract in place. So yeah, clinical supervision is something that the CQC are very, very interested in seeking assurance on.
Thanks, Gabi. And then the other question that got submitted by one of the people that was registering beforehand, I think it's quite a good question actually, but so was the previous one. What's made you smile when you've been inspecting or doing mock inspections? Smile in a good or bad way, who knows?
No, that's such a lovely question. I think it's really important because there are lots of positives that inspectors see out and about. I think the two things that came to mind are, from a staff point of view, it's always exciting and makes you smile when you see their confidence or their interest build over an inspection. We all know that initially many people could feel nervous or a little bit anxious about an inspection, or they're not quite sure what's going to happen because it might be their first inspection that they've been a part of. But if by sort of day 2 or 3, they're chatting to you, they're asking ad hoc questions, they're passing you in the corridor with a query here, or at the end of the day they want to follow up on this particular thing, that's always such a positive thing, and it happens more than people might believe. But I think seeing staff confidence grow over a period of time during an inspection is such an exciting thing, because what that means is that they're not afraid of governance, they're not afraid of compliance, and they can see the benefits of it, and they can see that if they get it right and they invest sort of energy and learning into it, then it can actually be something that ultimately results in more positive care for people. So from a staff perspective, I've always found that really enjoyable. I think the other answer to that question would always be any examples of really positive co-production. So in a GP practice, and I've mentioned this before, I think I couldn't remember which webinar, but one of the webinars of a service who I did an inspection for, and they had recently, well, they were renovating their reception area. And so what they wanted to do was have a walkthrough with the different patient groups to make sure that it was accessible. So they were asking patient groups to come in, have a look at the layout of the reception area, the notice boards, the accessibility in terms of bathrooms, screens, where the GPs or where the other healthcare professionals call you in. That was a really, really, in my view, fantastic opportunity for people to feel a part of the redesign and to benefit and to be able to then provide feedback so that their practice could then provide the best care. You know, we all know that kind of accessing healthcare can sometimes feel difficult for people for various reasons. So to alleviate any of those worries and to feel that patients in the community have contributed towards a smoother process was, you know, a really fantastic thing for me to see. And in adult social care, it was actually one of my first inspections, so sort of, yeah, many years ago, now gosh, about 7 or 8 years ago, it was a learning disability provider in the community, and this is a very simple example of co-production. We're not necessarily saying it's outstanding or anything, but it is just simple and beautiful, of having they were supporting people to plant vegetables and herbs and fruits in their garden, and then they were taking that food, they were cooking with it, then they were designing recipes, and then they managed to get a recipe book published and distributed across their local area. So that is an example of something coming full circle, but very much with people who are receiving care and community. So it wasn't sort of a product or a service that was offered to people or given to people. It was very much made and created by them for them, and then it benefited other people in their local area. So I think any examples of co-production always should make an inspector or any of us smile.
Thanks, Gabi. Those are really lovely examples. I think as providers, we get a bit worried sometimes about bringing in patients or service users, sort of consulting them, seeking their feedback. But if you could be clever about it, and if you're, for example, redesigning your reception area, or you want to change the outside of the building, then that's an ideal thing to get those people involved in, because it will actually be really helpful, and you can do something about it. Then you can actually act on their feedback and they feel empowered too. Thank you. So next up, we've got Gary, our former practice manager, who is going to put a couple of questions to Gabi now. I'll go on mute, Gary.
Yeah, thank you. It's a bit like an early Christmas gift, this, isn't it? Just asking a CQC inspector questions, I think. So for me, I always felt there were distinct phases or stages of that CQC inspection. You know, there was everything you had to do before the actual inspection, and then afterwards, because for me, there was always, you know, we want this evidence sent on. So looking at those, you know, before, during and after, what's the best way to work with your inspector at those distinct stages?
Yes, yeah. So thinking about these questions, I sort of did a bit of a brainstorm of so they're in no particular order, but I've tried to think of some top tips for the different before, during and after. And I suppose also the next question about what not to do before or after an inspection. So the first thing that came to mind was, please be honest if you're struggling. I think that's something that hopefully the inspector will create an environment for you to be able to say that. And if not, I hope that you can find the confidence to say that, because if you're struggling, for example, if you're nervous, if you're anxious, if actually something has happened, often what will happen is that an inspector might arrive at 9:30. You've already been at work for an hour and a half, and actually there's been a serious incident, or a staff member has called in that are unavailable to come to work, or there's a complaint that is on your desk that needs responding to in a timeline. And that is taking that is something that would be taking up you know, a lot of your thinking space, your energy, and is a priority for that particular day for you to resolve. Please be honest with us about what's going on for you. So if you need help from another colleague who is a specialist in that area, so let's say the CQC inspector initially wants to run through your information governance or your GDPR or your IT systems, it's okay for you to say, okay, I can tell you, but actually we've got someone who specialises in that particular area. I'm going to ask if they can come and talk through with you. I've got something that I need to respond to urgently, so I'll be available in this amount of time. It's much better for you to be transparent with the inspector rather than trying to be a yes person and to take it all on, because what you'll end up doing is not addressing things that we might then find out later and report upon as not addressing a risk, but it also means that you won't be in the headspace to communicate with the inspector for the rest of the day. So I think honesty and being transparent about areas that you need to prioritize would be a first tip for you. Similar to that is, again, make sure that you make the inspector aware of any existing plans that are taking place over the period of the inspection. So for example, if you've got a fire drill that's happening, or you've got team meetings, or you've got visiting professionals that are coming in, don't change or cancel a plan just because the inspection or the inspector is coming in. Simply tell the inspector this is what's happening. They are there to see business as usual in many ways. They're not there to see an inauthentic show. So as well as not cancelling, I would also say don't force anything. So don't create activities or don't create meetings just to show the inspector. If the inspector wants to see something specific, they will let you know. So they may ask a question in advance of even coming on site to say, when are your team meetings? And if you say, you know, it's the last Monday of every month, they might want to, and I've done this, to dial into that particular meeting at a later date as part of the inspection period. Or they might say, is it possible for you to bring it forward so that we can see the team come together? But wait to have that conversation with the inspector. Don't force things and don't cancel things. Just be as you were going to be, and hopefully the inspector will be able to work around that, and that will give them the best opportunities to report on how the service is running. Another thing that's really important, I think, particularly for your staff, is don't put us in a room. So we often get put in rooms, and I'll come on to that more in a minute. But what I was going to say is, please don't put us in a room where staff are then going to have off-duty time. So I have, for example, been put in like the canteen or the staff room to work from. That's really unfair for staff who are essentially taking their break. During a break, they all probably want to say things that we don't need to hear, and that's fine. They might want to take personal phone calls, they want to eat their sandwich, their lunch, they just want to talk about what they got up to at the weekend. It's never appropriate or fair for them to then be in a position where they can't relax or kind of switch off because there's an inspector in the room. So make sure that you're not putting us in a place where staff, you know, have their right to kind of have some time out. I think where you put the inspector is always a really interesting conversation, and each inspector will be different. So similar to everyone, you know, across your workforce, we all have different learning styles. I think and I've had scenarios where I've been put kind of in the coldest, saddest room in the corner and then left for sort of like 8 hours and things have been brought to me. But I've also had inspections where there is no space, so I'm sort of sat in a communal area. I would say having an option of both is ideal. So it's difficult. I don't want to sound too greedy, but having a place where as an inspector we can read records, you know, quietly, we can take time to make our own notes, you know, we can have conversations in private. Those things are all really beneficial, but that doesn't mean that we need to be put into the back office and then ignored for sort of 8 to 10 hours, because that also does happen. So I think facilitating a hybrid would be really beneficial. So if that means in advance sort of organising that, then that's something to think about. And I think leaving us alone for huge periods of time as an inspector is also another one to think about. Just have regular conversations with your inspector, so they, you know, between the two of you or whoever's facilitating it, you should be able to say, okay, I'm going to look at medical records now, I'm going to have a look at a sample of audits. Ideally, I'll be done by 11:30. Let's have a catch up then. So the conversation should be very fluid like that. If it doesn't feel like that and you're then leaving the room thinking, okay, I've left the inspector, they've got these documents, do I come back? Do I not come back? Shall I disturb them? Shall I not disturb them? Just ask, just say, shall I come back in an hour? If you've got any questions, you can let me know. That then facilitates a sort of a relationship where anything that the inspector, if they have questions, it's much better to ask the questions frequently throughout the day than it is to wait until the end of the day, because by that time they've probably already started to make a judgment and you may have missed opportunities to showcase the best of your work. So if you have regular catch-ups, even if it's only 3 or 4 minutes, they'll say, okay, I've just finished these audits, I wasn't quite sure about this bit, what do you think? You've got time to fetch the right information, but also they then might say, okay, next I'm going to look at complaints. So you'll say, great, I'll be back in 10 minutes, I'll bring the complaint to work and I'll also bring a response to the audit question. So I'd say try and facilitate a very fluid kind of conversation and relationship with the inspector where you can, and yeah, find that balance of leaving us alone but not ignoring us is always good.
Gabi, just on that, I'm just wondering about the bit before, because I used to, you know, in that 2-week notice period you get, you know, I used to gather all the evidence together and I'd have it in a big box file. And, you know, I suppose, and I bet a lot of practice managers think that, I wanted to get everything organised together so I could get the inspector out as quick as possible. You know, that, you know, if I'm being honest, but you wanted it to go as smooth as possible. So in terms of prepping before, what can I do?
Yeah, I mean, that is a good thing that you just mentioned, to have everything together as much as possible in advance. The argument that the inspector would have is that you shouldn't necessarily have to do that if your system's already good. So that's why we don't really talk about being inspection ready from a CQC point of view. We actually say that you should always be inspection ready, which, you know, controversial statement, depending on which side of the fence you're sat on. If I come in and, because don't forget, particularly in adult social care as well, inspections are unannounced, so not everybody gets notice, and you know, sometimes in healthcare it's not announced either. To be ready, you should always be ready, in the sense that hopefully your governance systems, your filing systems, the way that you manage your paperwork is already accessible, so that if an inspector does come in and say, we're going to focus on this area first, you're not having an anxiety moment in your mind. You're thinking, okay, great, I know which folder that is on the shared drive. I know that, you know, Claire is the lead in that particular area, so I'll let the inspector know and potentially schedule a call with her later. That's probably where PMs versus CQC inspectors would differ in their view of how to be ready. But you can tell, I mean, like any of us, we can tell when there's a difference between being organised and creating an inauthentic or an inaccurate representation of the service. So it's finding that balance, I think.
Really helpful. I could ask you loads and loads of questions, and we didn't even talk about bribing an inspector, but thank you very much.
No problem.
Bribing inspector, I like it. I'll take the, actually, Gary, would you mind carrying on? Ketan's not managed to make it on the call, our GP partner, which is probably a reflection of the fact that he's a GP partner. But we had some questions from him as well. We've got sort of 5-10 minutes max, Gary, if you want to try these ones as well on Gabi.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the interview one's really interesting. You know, as a practice manager, I would try and prep people, but I never knew whether I was doing it in the right way. I was asking them the right things, and it's always something you're quite anxious about yourself. know, as a practice manager, the interview seems to last the day. But, you know, yeah, what's the best way to prep, particularly in other individuals, for those interviews, Gabi?
Yeah, so I actually was thinking about this question, which is my fault, for registration. So an interview, the registration interview with the inspector. But thinking about it, there's probably quite a lot of crossovers between that. So when trying to prep your staff, the main things I would say is they need to have, and we're not asking for people to have a comprehensive understanding of all of the legislation and all of the requirements from a CQC, but we do hope that they have some, like a kind of a foundation understanding of what the CQC are looking for. So if we take a very high level approach, person-centered care, a CQC inspector knows, okay, that's Regulation 9 under the Health and Social Care Act. A support worker or a reception or an administrative staff member or a GP doesn't need to know the ins and outs, but they need to know that person-centered care is something that's A, important, and B, that the CQC inspector will be looking for. So I would do a little bit of work with them in advance on the fundamental standards. So they are thinking about person-centered care, safe care and treatment, dignity and respect. Doing some exercises with them in advance. You know, team exercises are fine, you know, it doesn't need to be one-to-one. But saying to them, okay, what examples, how do we demonstrate that we treat people with dignity and respect? And see what your colleagues say. You know, it just takes one staff member to have a good idea. If the 10 other people in the room hear it, when you're doing that team exercise, it will get them thinking, oh yeah, we do that, don't we? And we do this. Before you know it, you've probably covered, let's just say that we use an example of if a patient comes in and they want to speak privately, we have a room at the side. Let's just say that's one person's idea of dignity and respect. Before you know it, you've then also covered that you provide safe care, that you're person-centered, that you provide, potentially you're thinking about protected characteristics or people that might need reasonable adjustments. You're thinking about your premises and equipment that's in place to facilitate that conversation. So one idea will actually cover a lot of what the CQC are looking for. So I would try and do example team exercises in advance, but focusing on the kind of a high level area for the fundamental standards. Another thing which we all know from having done interviews over the years, I'm sure everyone on this call has had a bad interview and a good interview, is that you can, when we're asking for examples, we don't, what we'd rather hear is one really detailed case or one example rather than a kind of an overview of something. So if we say, for example, let's think about consent. Okay, so what's the consent process? We'd rather hear you say, okay, when a patient calls up or when they want to make an inquiry or when they come in, this is what's requested of them, this is where it's documented, this is how we then seek it before we, you know, carry out kind of the care and treatment, or we offer them a chaperone if they want. It's much better to talk about a patient journey or a very specific example than it is to just say, we've got a policy and I did training and we definitely do it. Okay, because that's often what people will say is, yeah, we definitely do consent, or we are safe, or no, I'm definitely person-centered, but they can't necessarily give a really clear example. So I would say the STAR acronym is my favourite acronym for all interviews, which is the situation, task, action and result. So again, encouraging staff to have a couple of STAR examples in their mind of, you know, work that they're proud of, work that they think that they're doing really well in. Yeah, I would encourage that as a start as well.
Yeah.
So start fundamental standards.
Yeah, and that's great advice. And I never did the training to that degree, but you know, I think that's really helpful. I never thought about using STAR, which is a recognised interview technique. There's a shortened version, which is CAR, context, action, result, that would probably work just as well and a little bit easier. On the second question that we've got here, Gabi, it'd be interesting to know about challenging and inaccuracy, because it's so important to get that right. But I want to throw in an extra word on this as well, and this is inconsistency in inspections, whether, you know, it's how you challenge that as well as inaccuracies.
Yeah, that's a good, very good point. So I think the main thing here is And again, often what we come across, either when I was an inspector receiving factual accuracy, FAC-ACT challenges, or having submitted them myself, being on the other side of the fence to an inspector, is that the main thing to say is that there will be, and there always will be, there always has been, a discretion in how you choose to meet the regulations and the fundamental standards. So the CQC can advise on relevant guidelines, relevant legislation to follow. So we all know, for example, about NICE guidelines. They're recognised best practice platforms. But if you as a provider choose a specific route for care and treatment that's outside of the standard or recognised best practice guidelines, that's okay, as long as you record the process, or we would encourage you to record the process you went through to arrive at that decision and the clinical reasoning that has led to these decisions. What that then means is, if you've got a recording of the rationale in quite a clear format, so if you've got a risk assessment that you've completed, or you've had a management meeting, you know, you've met with the partners and you've decided this is a particular way that you're going to work, as long as you've got that documented, it will come in handy during the factual accuracy comments challenge process. Because sometimes you see that inspectors will say they haven't followed best practice guidance, therefore it's not safe, it's not effective, it's not well led. It's not for an inspector to say what process you should follow, it's for them to talk about the effectiveness of the outcomes. So always think that if you're going outside of the box, you know, if you're sort of breaking the mold a little bit in terms of the guidance and the best practice route that you do follow, make sure you document that. And then if the CQC do decide to criticise or challenge the choices that you've made, you've got a really easy way to respond to that, and you're not then sort of spending evenings thinking, why did we not follow that particular guidance, or how do we tell them that it is safe, because you've already got that rationale and that risk assessment in place. So I think that's the first thing to, or probably the main thing to hold on to. The factual accuracy process, the challenging process, is very straightforward. So you as a provider will receive the report. I think at the moment, because it's portal led, you'll receive a link that will usually go to the registered manager and the nominated individual. So you'll receive an email link. You have 10 working days. You've always had 10 working days. That hasn't changed under the new single assessment framework, to respond to anything within the report that you would like to. And you use the online portal or the Word document that the CQC provide for you. So there are three main areas that you can challenge. The fundamental one is typos or numerical errors. So for example, job titles, number of staff spoken to, number of patients, or demographics. The second part is anything that has contributed to a judgment that you believe to be factually inaccurate. So if, for example, they've commented on percentages in an audit that have led to a that they think demonstrates a requires improvement, but actually they've misinterpreted the audit or they've misread the audit, and you've got the correct figures, you can submit those and say, actually, it's this. It may not change the score or the rating, but it's important that they have accurate data. And then you can also submit any information that you didn't have an opportunity potentially to discuss during the inspection, or that you feel you did discuss but has been omitted, that's key to a rating. So what that means, because when you think about a report, especially now that the goal is to make them shorter, it's always based on evidence collected during the assessment, but they can't include everything that they covered during the assessment. So, but if you think that actually you did show them something particularly outstanding and that hasn't been mentioned, it's okay to remind them of it and say, you know, I know we discussed this, it's disappointing to see it wasn't in the report, I'm going to reattach it, or here's a little bit more information about it, because we believe that this, you know, demonstrates good or outstanding practice. So you can remind them of anything additional that you think was omitted, or any examples of things that you've done since the inspection to make a positive change. And then there's a different conversation then about how that's reported upon from an inspection point of view, mindful of time. But yeah, an inspector could essentially say, it was good, we've since had assurance that things are even better, but that won't affect your rating, or it could affect your rating if they've got assurance that, you know, the way in which it's been embedded. But either way, it's likely that a reporter will comment on changes that have been made. So it's always important to keep them up to date with any improvements you've made as a result of their visit. And potential outcomes, very straightforward. You could either get a better rating, you could get a worse rating, or your rating could stay the same. It has happened all three ways, so be prepared. And that's it.
Thank you, Gabi. I guess they say that about getting your exam remarked as well. Be careful what you wish for sometimes. I think in the new year, because we want to carry on this webinar series very much and keep it free, I think one of the topics that we'll cover on a whole session will be about sort of challenging your report in a bit more detail and what the potential outcomes are, and talking about reputation as well and where that factors into your decision making about challenging or not. So look out for that one in the new year. I will hand over to Rashad now to take us through some slides about the medicines management team. And while he's doing that, he'll only be 5 minutes or so. If anybody has any burning questions for Gabi, they can start popping them in the chat, ideally, or the Q&A if you can't access the chat, and we'll keep an eye on those. But we are sharing our details at the end if you want to email us privately with any questions. Rashad.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Yeah, definitely no CQC questions for me. Thank you for the amazing presentation. My name is Rashad. I'm a director of the medicines management team. Essentially, we're a training and development organisation. We seek to empower pharmacists and pharmacy technicians working in primary care. And what we're providing is a managed pharmacist and pharmacy technician service to GP practices and PCNs across the UK. So if you're a GP practice or a PCN, looking to recruit a pharmacist or pharmacy technician, be that short-term cover, long-term cover, it can be maternity or sickness cover, get in touch. If you have any excess Rs funding that you want to utilise until the end of March, definitely let us know and see how we can help you. Now, the medicines management